In the heart of global finance, there's a silent storm brewing. The world's two largest economies, the US and China, are on a collision course. Economic titans once intertwined through trade are now facing off in an escalating trade war. But this conflict isn't just about tariffs or trade deficits. It's about something far more consequential, the future of global power. And the person sounding the alarm? Renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs. In a recent interview, Sachs didn't mince words. He described the current state of US-China relations as extremely dangerous, warning that the situation could spiral out of control. What was once a diplomatic and economic partnership has now become a high-stakes battle that threatens not just the US and China, but the entire global order. In 2025, after imposing massive tariffs on Chinese goods, former President Donald Trump's administration ignited a trade war that would go on to disrupt global markets and shake diplomatic foundations. But Jeffrey Sachs is concerned that these tariffs are only the beginning of a much bigger conflict. Sachs believes that the ongoing tariffs could push the US and China into uncharted waters, with both nations playing a dangerous game of economic brinkmanship. The stakes are high, and the question remains, can the US and China avoid a catastrophic conflict, or is it already too late? The world has been watching closely, as trade relations between these two global giants become more fractured by the day. And Sachs' message is clear: if the US and China cannot find a way to de-escalate, the fallout will be felt across the world. From markets to military strategies, this conflict could set the stage for a new global order. Jeffrey Sachs, an economist with decades of experience, is sounding the alarm about the US-China trade conflict. Sachs warns that the trade war ignited by former President Donald Trump's tariffs has escalated beyond economic competition, it's becoming a global crisis. Sachs doesn't mince words when describing the potential consequences. He calls the current path taken by the US and China extremely dangerous. The growing tariffs, he says, are not just economic measures, they are dangerous provocations that could lead to far-reaching consequences. Sachs argues that the tariffs imposed on China were just the beginning. The economic consequences of these aggressive actions could lead to a global geopolitical crisis that the world is not prepared for. Sachs warns that the escalation of tariffs could lead to more than just a trade war. With both countries having significant military power and influence, the stakes are higher than ever. What started as an economic conflict could quickly turn into a geopolitical standoff, with devastating consequences for global security. Historically, the US and China were interdependent, benefiting from mutual trade and cooperation. But now, this once thriving partnership is unraveling. Sachs emphasizes that the trade war could irreparably damage the relationship between the two countries, shifting the balance of global power. As the trade war continues, Sachs argues that both sides are losing more than they're gaining. The tariffs imposed by the Trump administration have already had a significant impact on China's economy, and Sachs believes that China's retaliation could be just as damaging to the US. In response, China has begun to retaliate, imposing tariffs on key US exports like soybeans, aircraft, and high-tech products. This back and forth has created a vicious cycle of economic retaliation that has yet to show any signs of slowing down. Sachs believes that the real risk lies in economic self-destruction. The longer the US and China push forward with tariffs and economic sanctions, the more they risk an all-out financial war that could lead to recessions in both countries, and potentially the rest of the world. As the US and China continue their tit-for-tat tariff war, Sachs warns that the situation is quickly moving from economic rivalry to a dangerous geopolitical confrontation. The road ahead looks increasingly uncertain, and the stakes are higher than ever. As the tariffs escalate, the global financial markets are reacting in real time. With each new round of tariffs, uncertainty spreads across global markets, causing stocks to plummet and economies to stall. Sachs has warned that these policies, while targeting China, are beginning to have devastating impacts on the US economy as well. With the US imposing tariffs that have soared from 104% to 125%, Sachs warns that this won't just hurt China. It's hurting American consumers as well. Higher tariffs mean higher prices for everyday goods, especially consumer electronics, machinery, and other imports from China. It's not just businesses and markets that are feeling the effects, everyday consumers are also bearing the burden. With price hikes on imported goods, the average American family is seeing their purchasing power shrink. Sachs argues that these policies will eventually lead to consumer dissatisfaction and a slowdown in economic growth. The agriculture sector is especially hard hit by China's retaliation, with tariffs on U.S. soybeans, pork, and other agricultural exports making it difficult for American farmers to sustain their businesses. Sachs highlights how this economic backlash can deepen the pain felt by U.S. industries, potentially leading to job losses. On the other side, China is also feeling the weight of the tariffs. Sachs warns that the retaliatory measures by China, raising tariffs on American goods, are stifling U.S. exports. This economic decoupling will hurt both countries, and Sachs fears it could lead to supply chain disruptions and global recession. The ripple effects of these tariff wars are being felt across global supply chains. Sachs emphasizes that with both the U.S. and China fighting for dominance, businesses around the world are facing uncertainty, leading to increased costs and inefficiencies. Goldman Sachs has estimated that the 125% tariff on Chinese goods could cut China's GDP growth by 2.9 percentage points. With the U.S. economy also taking a hit, Sachs believes this tariff conflict could lead to a global slowdown, lowering global GDP growth projections. As Sachs points out, the world economy is no longer immune from this economic war. With the U.S. and China trading blows, the global financial system is on edge. This isn't just a bilateral issue, it has far-reaching consequences for markets worldwide. One of the most dangerous wild cards Sachs warns about is China's holdings of U.S. treasuries. With over $760 billion in U.S. debt, China has the power to destabilize global markets by selling off its holdings. If China decides to make a move, the resulting financial shockwaves could be devastating. The economic fallout from the U.S.-China trade conflict is already unfolding, and Sachs believes that the situation will only worsen as tariffs continue to rise. The growing instability in markets, industries, and consumer confidence is a harbinger of a global economic crisis if the trade war isn't resolved soon. As the tariffs continue to rise, Sachs warns that the conflict between the U.S. and China is quickly evolving into something much more dangerous. What began as an economic dispute is now veering toward a potential geopolitical standoff, with both nations' military power and influence on the line. Sachs believes that continued tariff increases could trigger a military confrontation, especially in regions like the South China Sea, where both the U.S. and China have critical interests. The rise in military tensions is an alarming possibility that goes beyond trade wars. While neither country has openly called for war, Sachs points out that an escalating trade war could lead to military posturing in critical regions, with both countries ramping up their presence in the South China Sea and elsewhere. The more the tariffs increase, the greater the chance of a misstep or provocation that could trigger a full-blown conflict. In both the U.S. and China, political leaders have framed the conflict as a matter of national security. The longer the tariffs last, the more entrenched the idea becomes that this is not just a trade war, it's a fight for global supremacy. This sets the stage for escalating tensions, both economically and geopolitically. The international community is beginning to feel the ripple effects of this conflict. Sachs argues that the global order could change if the US and China continue down this path. The economic fallout is already being felt across Europe and Asia, and the growing military tension is something that no nation can ignore. Sachs firmly believes that the only way to prevent this conflict from spiraling out of control is through diplomatic dialogue. He stresses that the US and China must find a way to cooperate, to create a new framework for trade that is fair and balanced, without threatening global peace. Sachs calls on both nations to put aside their differences and return to the negotiating table, acknowledging that economic policies must be rooted in cooperation, not conflict. The diplomatic pathway is the only way to avoid devastating consequences for the global community. Sachs envisions a future where the US and China can reach a peaceful resolution, de-escalating the conflict and rebuilding mutual trust. Through dialogue and cooperation, the two nations can avoid a devastating global conflict, preserving the global economic order for future generations. Sachs reminds us that the stakes of this trade war are far greater than mere tariffs or economic policies. The choices made by the US and China today will shape the future of not only their nations, but the entire world. The question is, will they choose peace and cooperation, or will the world be thrust into a new era of conflict and instability? The US and China are not the only countries caught in the crossfire of this escalating trade war. The entire world is feeling the effects. From global markets to international diplomatic relations, the repercussions of this conflict stretch far beyond just two superpowers. The World Trade Organization, WTO, has confirmed that the decoupling of the US and China will have far-reaching effects on global trade. The WTO has slashed its global GDP growth forecast for 2025 from 3.2% to just 2.2%, signaling the strain this trade war is placing on the entire world economy. Manufacturing hubs around the world are also feeling the squeeze. As US-China trade decouples, companies that rely on both markets are left scrambling to adapt. For many, shifting supply chains has become increasingly difficult. Across Europe, the tariffs are already taking their toll. The impact of the US-China trade war is sending shockwaves through the European economy, with businesses facing rising costs and decreased demand for their products. Sachs warns that the European Union could be on the verge of a recession if this trade war continues to unfold. Even countries far from the US-China conflict are feeling the strain. In Africa, South America, and Asia, nations dependent on global trade are facing economic uncertainty. Sachs warns that the effects of the trade war are exacerbating poverty and inequality, threatening to set back decades of economic progress in some of the world's most vulnerable regions. As the US and China continue to push forward with their conflicting economic strategies, the rest of the world is left to pick up the pieces. Global leaders are calling for diplomatic intervention, urging both superpowers to consider the long-term consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for the entire world. As Sachs points out, the relationship between the US and China has gone from being a symbol of global cooperation to one of economic isolation. Both nations are now moving toward separate trading blocs, and the world must now adjust to a new reality where the US and China no longer lead in unison. The international community knows that the longer the US and China remain at odds, the greater the risk of economic collapse and military conflict. But Sachs believes that with the right diplomatic efforts, the two superpowers can still find a way to cooperate, before it's too late. The clock is ticking. The US-China conflict is a crossroads, not just for the two nations involved, but for the entire world. As the global economy continues to feel the strain, the question remains, will diplomacy prevail, or will we be left to navigate an increasingly fragmented and unstable world? While the situation may seem bleak, Sachs believes that the solution is still within reach. His message is clear: if the US and China want to avoid an economic and geopolitical collapse, they must return to the table, put aside their differences, and engage in diplomatic dialogue. Sachs argues that the US and China need to find a way to cooperate on global economic issues, instead of using economic warfare as a tool for dominance. In his view, the growing tensions between the two nations are counterproductive and will ultimately hurt both parties, as well as the rest of the world. The only way forward, Sachs believes, is to engage in meaningful diplomatic negotiations that focus on finding a balance of interests. The US and China must move beyond short-term victories and work toward a long-term framework for cooperative trade that benefits both nations and the global community. For Sachs, the current trade war is a test of leadership. He urges both countries to move away from economic nationalism and towards globalism, a world where nations work together to resolve disputes, share resources, and create mutually beneficial solutions. If the US and China can find common ground and restore their trade relations, Sachs believes the benefits will be enormous. Global markets will stabilize, industries will thrive, and the tensions between the two nations will ease, providing a foundation for a more peaceful and cooperative future. Sachs emphasizes that the future belongs to the next generation, a generation that believes in the power of collaboration over competition, innovation over isolation. For the sake of future generations, it's critical that the US and China set aside their differences and work together for a better tomorrow. Sachs concludes with a call to action. It's time for the US and China to lead by example, to show the world that cooperation and diplomacy are the only viable paths to global peace and prosperity. The world is watching, and the decisions made today will shape the future for generations to come. As the US and China stand at a crossroads, Sachs' call for diplomacy is more crucial than ever. If the two nations can find a way to work together, the possibilities are endless. But the path to peace will require courage, compromise, and a willingness to put the global good ahead of national interests. The stakes are high. The US-China conflict is not just about trade wars, tariffs, or economic retaliation. It's a defining moment for the future of the world order. With the global economy teetering on the edge, the choices made today will determine the global landscape for generations to come. But there is still time to change course. The question is, will the world choose to continue down the path of division and conflict, or will the US and China, along with the global community, come together to build a new era of cooperation, dialogue, and mutual benefit? In the face of growing uncertainty, Sachs remains hopeful. The future is not set in stone. Through cooperation and mutual respect, both nations can rewrite the rules of engagement, leading the world toward an era of stability, prosperity, and peace. Sachs' message is clear: the future depends on the choices made today. The US and China can choose to resolve their differences through collaboration, not conflict, and lead the world toward a future of shared prosperity and peace. The road ahead is still open. We are at a crossroads, and the choices made now will shape the world for decades to come. But with courage, vision, and a commitment to peace, the US and China can lead the way into a new era, one where global cooperation is the cornerstone of progress. The choice is ours. Will we allow fear and division to dictate our future, or will we rise to the challenge and build a world where peace, cooperation, and mutual benefit are the foundation of global success? The road ahead is uncertain, but it is not too late to choose a better path. Together, we can create a future where all nations thrive in harmony.